Yeah.
Welcome. We are here at COP26. It's the second week, and it's also like drawing hopefully to a close soon, but not yet because many issues still need to be resolved. We are here in the session called Climate Talks Without Jargon, and maybe we can do a very quick round of introductions with whom we have here on the panel, starting.
Yeah. So I'm Robert Bergsvik, doing a PhD at Wageningen University on climate finance transparency.
And on the left is Helena Solon, also from Wageningen University, focusing on energy transitions towards wind and the role of public engagement in this transition.
I'm Robin Smale. I'm also a PhD candidate at Wageningen University. I work on householder participation in smart grids.
My name is Max. I'm a PhD student at Wageningen University, focusing on the role of transparency in international climate governance.
I'm Lia Zakia, now PhD student at George Mason University, USA, and I used to work for the Indonesian government at the Office of the President's Special Envoy for Climate Change.
Thank you very much. And to get things started right away, this COP is being framed as a very important one to keep the 1.5 degree target alive, to announce more ambitious targets. But Leah, maybe you could share a little bit about your perspective on the role of this summit and what items you find very important.
Yeah, so the important thing that I think we need to achieve is on the finance mechanism of how to move forward with climate action globally. Because me as from Indonesia, a developing country but emerging economy, we're the fourth largest population in the world, and we will have really big economy. We will be hosting the G20 summit next year. So we are very powerful in terms of climate. Either we contribute more pollution, carbon pollution, or we can also help in contributing to reducing greenhouse gas emission with the better management of our forests and our resources. But the thing here that I see and I feel is like the lack of trust between parties. Especially developed countries, it shouldn't be like that. Because like in Paris, we've already agreed that everyone here is on board with a different capacity. Yeah? And so what I wanted to see here in COP is like the developed country really fulfill their commitment to help the developing country and then also least developed countries on their climate mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage. That they have made a commitment to start paying it in 2020. It's now more than 2020 and we still haven't heard anything. They wanted to push it back. So this, I think, create untrust condition between countries, and also developing countries. We are not like sitting around as well. There are also some progress being made. Sometimes South and South cooperation also already made, because like sometimes some of the parties feel like the angst of it, like let's do something, even though we don't really have the necessary action, because like most southern countries, global South countries, still deal with poverty. A lot of people still don't have access to electricity, and then in vulnerable conditions. A lot of small islands, a lot of people live in the coastal areas, and they don't have the capacity to deal with climate impacts as well. So we really need to build this cooperation, and then also to ensure that the transition is conducted in a just way, with the intention that it's not the developing countries being the market of the technology from developed countries, because if they need to help us, they also need to, working together how to improve the capacity so that we are also be, main player as well in the new economy, as we can say. So that's, I think, my personal hope for this one. I wanted to see that is going forward.
Thank you very much for explaining that, and indeed the need for this international solidarity among developed and developing countries. And you talk about the importance of climate finance on mitigation, but also on adaptation and loss and damage, and not seeing developing countries as a market, but also as a place to develop new technologies. And on this, my colleague Robert has done quite some work, and I maybe want to ask, like, how are we currently doing on providing this climate finance on these matters?
Yeah, so I think that is what these elaborate transparency arrangements are supposed to shed light on, right? Like, because developing countries joined the Paris Agreement on the promise that developed countries would pay for climate action and also stimulate more and more adaptation and mitigation projects. But in connection with this $100 billion goal that was made back in 2009, it was supposed to be delivered by 2020. We are now in 2021, and it has been made clear that this goal has not been reached, and the deadline has been pushed for 2023. Yet the finance that has been mobilized or delivered, we are also not really sure exactly what the nature of that finance really is. And even with 6 years of reporting on climate finance, both by developed countries that are providing the finance and developing countries that are receiving the finance, we don't really know exactly what has been transferred, because there are a lot of fundamental definitional issues in the climate finance transparency landscape. To just mention a very obvious one, there is no definition of what counts as climate finance. And right now there are several definitions being used by different developed countries when they report under the UN reporting and review regime, which just does not contribute to much clarity on what is being done in this space. And the lack of definition is, of course, a technical problem, but it also may be a very political problem. As we saw yesterday in the transparency negotiations, there were several developed countries that pushed back on the urgent call by several developing countries, such as South Africa, for having one clear, multilaterally agreed upon definition of climate finance. So then that begs the question, is it just a technical difficulty, or are developed countries resisting having clarity on this, and why is that the case?
Yeah, thank you very much for that explanation, and yeah, it really shows that there seems to be some reluctance from the developed country side to be clear about what finance they provided, and also seems almost to be a reluctance to provide climate finance, and that is then again damaging trust, as you mentioned, on the other side. Talking about trust, I think you also had something to say about it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. What I've seen. What I've seen so far on this issue of trust, quite some interesting things going on at the pavilion. There seem to be a lot of different technological solutions floating around for dealing with issues of trust. So of course there's all the carbon reporting that has to happen in the broadest sense. So there's a lot of data related to climate change, and the use of for example, blockchain to create unchangeable information systems is seen as one way of kind of avoiding all the trust issues. I think it's interesting to look at this from a critical perspective. I don't think it's all that realistic to think that you can solve this kind of trust issues between nations and in local environments through the application of blockchain technologies, for example, by tokenizing information flows, for example, related to renewable energy purchase and sale from different sources. I think you always need to look at the local situations to see what kind of potential these technologies really have. And not to be too much of a downer on it, I think there is definite potential for information technologies to create more transparency and more accountability on these issues. For example, guaranteeing that parties that you make agreements with, that they indeed achieve renewable energy targets, but merely locking it down in digital systems, such as through blockchain technologies. I think we shouldn't stop the thinking there. I think we should really keep a critical eye on how these kind of applications are developed. So if it's developed in an inclusive way, if it's large companies that are involved in it, if it becomes a business model to export, let's say, also who is able to use it and make benefits from it. So, you could, for example, use what I've learned, AI to help respond to disasters by processing satellite images of floodings. You can use AI to find the most vulnerable people. So, I mean, these are really useful, valuable applications, but can you make sure that most vulnerable people, most vulnerable nations and regions can actually make use of these kind of tools, and it does not become a business model to export? I think these are some questions to keep in mind. So going around a little bit skeptically in the pavilion is very relevant, I think. Yeah.
You make an important case here that the technology in and of itself is maybe not enough and will not automatically guarantee a fair outcome for all involved. And talking about technology and the involvement of people in it, I think that's a nice segue to go to your area of studies.
Yeah, thank you, Max. I totally agree and follow with the same interest as Robin does, the developments around the digitalization, especially in the energy sector. So I was very inspired to see that European Union actually is speaking now of digital twin transition in many different sectors, and looking from the perspective of energy sector, this is something that I really observe as being the premise for the future, where digitalizing assets, but also digitalizing concerns and digitalizing areas of environment is becoming increasingly important. So we see European Union developing digital twin of the Earth and digital twin of different systems. And what I think is a key question to ask is who is pulling really the ropes, behind these models? What kind of aspects of the energy system are being optimized and for whom? So indeed.
Maybe also to go on the Talk Without Jargon, what does a digital twin mean? What is that?
Exactly, that's a very good question. And I think what the true answer is that for many people it means something else. I think if you ask the engineers, they will say it's a virtual representation of an asset or a system that is being translated into the digital in real time. So imagine you have, for example, a wind turbine or a wind farm, and that is being in real time traced in a virtual setting. So for example, you can think of a 3D prototype that actually consists of all the different components of the system, and then there are engineers who are really observing and then reacting to this system in the digital. So the potential of it is that you can simulate the systems and see how they will respond to different factors, and that for climate, you can imagine, can have huge implications when we are able to not only predict, anticipate, but also maybe intervene in issues related to climate or the systems that belong to it. And that directly, I think, has implications for what kind of solutions are being picked. So I think if you, for example, think about optimizing the systems for energy efficiency, we will see that for energy sector or for wind energy sector, it really means going large-scale, utility-scale wind farm developments offshore, large-scale onshore. And I think one of the potential consequences is that it can push away the community-based projects. So I think it means that, perhaps small-scale wind farms, even though they might have a local support, they will not be part of that that vision, or they might be, but not well. They are probably not being seen as one of the key solutions to it. So I'm really intrigued to hear that also experts and representatives of different energy clusters, wind energy, nuclear energy, really putting forward here at the pavilions their visions about what the energy sector will look like. And well, I think they all have their own vision about it, but I don't see so much dialogue. So that's I think that's the future will have.
Was there anything about community energy that you noticed? Like, was community energy something noticeable in this kind of pavilions?
I would say not so much at the energy pavilions themselves. I think these conversations do happen, but they happen within different kind of communities. So there's I did follow some of the conversations around energy justice and indeed environmental impacts, and there's great work done in these domains. But so far I think that.
I also didn't hear industry talk too much about these kind of things, whereas in the country pavilions or experiences from cities or governments, that there was more attention for it.
Yeah. Although what did concern me a little bit was that the fact that the huge energy pavilions, they have a lot of power in reaching out to the country representatives who come to them, asking them very basic questions. How do I make sure that I meet my targets? What I have to do? How much wind energy? How much nuclear energy I have to develop, and how I will do it fast? Because that's what the pressure is, and I'm afraid that in these conversations there is not so much space for local level considerations and concerns that relate to these very technologies. So, I would hope that it will become a part of the next conversations. But of course, I worry it's a bit too late for this at this COP already.
Interesting, and maybe so you're mentioning there seems to be a sort of dominant narrative prevailing in those energy pavilions about a large-scale approach towards providing sustainable energy rather than community-based. Now, I wanted to ask Robert, you're focusing on finance. How in that domain, what types of observations do you have when you look at the events and the pavilions you see here?
Yeah, I think you put it very succinctly that it's very much on a large scale what happens here at the COP, and that also seems to be the approach to providing climate finance. There are in the lead up to this COP, there have been a multitude of alliances built across the financial sector involving insurance companies, banks, asset managers, all coming together and supposedly taking climate action through the concept that we've been hearing so much about these 2 weeks, which is the net zero commitments that are being made. And net zero is a very interesting and quite an abstract concept, which now is being used by politicians, by the private sector, by the media. But what it actually means is still something that could maybe be seen as a bit unclear. And also the net zero targets that we see companies are setting for themselves. Really, you kind of have to go into the wording of how companies are going to become net zero and when, right? Like, what kind of climate action involves or falls under this net zero commitment? And I'm not so sure what it actually means. So we'll have to follow this with quite critical eyes, because the financial sector has promised that it will divest from fossil fuels. It will exponentially invest in renewable energy. But we see that a lot of these different large banks that have signed these net zero commitments are still involved both deforestation. They are still funding fossil fuel companies in the billions. To mention a few, J.P. Morgan and HSBC, which are very, very large investment banks with a global reach, who are all part of the COP UK presidency's announcement on the Net Zero Financial Alliance. So I think this is a strange place to be observing, and we know that outside of these COP walls, protesters are calling the net zero commitments simply a scam for a way to kind of greenwash something that will certainly make a lot of money for particular groups of people, but we're not really sure whether it will actually translate into tangible and sorely needed climate action.
Yeah.
And
just a tiny follow-up, because
Yeah.
you say it's going to make a lot of money for some people, but could you explain that? And also, net zero has something to do with a balance, right?
It has. So net zero refers to the removal of more carbon emissions than you are emitting, and this removal is intended to be done through a series of carbon removal technologies, such as carbon capture and storage, and also planting a billion trees within a set time period. But especially touching upon carbon capture and storage, this is a very speculative technology that now many countries are embracing, but we actually don't know whether it will work, especially on a large scale. It seems that with the current technology that underpins the carbon capture and storage, it actually needs to rely on fossil fuel energy to be able to capture all that CO2 that is intended to capture.
Thanks for that follow-up, and I think we should slowly go to a conclusion maybe, but before doing so I wanted to come back to you, because as you see there have been these large targets for 2050, large targets by countries, by companies, but at the end of the day it needs to translate into action at the local level basically, and I guess this is sometimes also a sort of tension field, right? And I know you're working at the municipality.
Yeah.
You're also working with wind farms and their public participation at the local level. So I was wondering if you could maybe reflect a little bit on the difficulty or the promise of implementing some of these targets locally.
Yeah, I think judging from my experiences, local governments and local actors, they have built up a lot of knowledge and experience in recent years in the energy transition. In the Netherlands, it's been really taking off just in recent years. It's also taking its toll on local populations. People see their environment change rapidly. At least they feel like the energy transition is making a genuine impact on their environment. Wind turbines very tall, they are visible. Solar parks use a lot of land, and not everyone's too happy about this. So what you want to do as a local government, and what we strive for, is to have high quality projects that actually maybe even improve the environment, make it attractive to go there. For example, by having solar parks be bordered by as much green as possible, having profits from the project go to beautification of the landscape. Of course, citizens should also benefit from the project by sharing the profits. So that's financial participation. And of course, throughout the whole design of the process. So you should strive for co-creation as much as possible. But what we also see is that local governments, they do rely on, like we do, on private actors and energy companies, energy cooperatives, to really take these concerns seriously. And you're in a continuous battle to make sure that your standards and your values, they are taken seriously, and they are brought into effect by the private companies that tend to push much of the energy transition. So this is a constant struggle.
how do you see that struggle?
Absolutely. I think that Robin just had hit the note on the taking concerns seriously, because that's something that, I don't develop the wind power projects, but I do follow their processes. And the one thing that I'm always said by from the local people is that they want to be taken seriously, and that does not mean a passive participation. That does not mean asking people to accept the projects, but it means that really we need to sit down with people and start discussion that it's open and equal on what kind of energies we'll be investing in, rather than assuming that this or that technology would be a perfect solution, and really engaging people, because they are experts on their environment. They know really well, and oftentimes they're really interested. So I think it's that just a misassumption or misunderstanding that the local people, they need to be convinced to, and then compensated perhaps in the simplest terms for the negative impacts, and engaged only when it's too late. And I'm also, on the other hand, quite sure that the wind energy sector and other sectors in the renewable energy, they do realize that now. There is actually quite already a lot of experience building up, and that of resistance, and that have really pushed them to reconsider their practices. And I think they are increasingly being open and embracing new forms of engagement, new technologies of participation, which I think will be the key in really taking the citizens more seriously. But again, maybe reiterating what Robin said, it's really about taking the citizens as a starting point rather as the end point. So, that would be, I think, my concluding remark this way.
Thank you. Yeah, I was before we completely conclude, and I think this is a very good point, like taking the concerns seriously of local people, and don't say we need to convince them of doing it a certain way, but having a true dialogue and true participation. Before closing, I want to do a small round, because we're all PhD students at Wageningen University at the EMP group, spending most of our time behind the laptop with Corona at home. What does it feel like to attend a place like this? How does it make you feel? And what is a more personal reflection? And maybe I'm going to start with Robert and work this way.
Yeah, I mean, I have to be honest, it's quite a mad place. You can be, just observing leaders of state or celebrities walking in the halls with cameras running after them, and it's quite I would say a spectacle. But when you dive into the negotiations, as both me and Max have been doing, you find that there are real serious issues being discussed here, and that is quite a jarring experience, I would say, and especially when you see the fact that so many things are being pushed by developing countries who are in need of serious assistance, and not being, I would say, prioritized by the developed countries who are really much holding this place in their hand, because it is under the UK presidency, and this is a very particular way of organizing a climate summit. So yeah, that's quite a strange thing to experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with my colleague Robert that the stakes are high, and the interest of so many different people from many different backgrounds and expertise is really huge. And I think that's also the key asset of such an event, is that we actually have the opportunity to meet and discuss and really learn from each other. So I think that what's the most inspiring to me is when people actually open up and not only come with their own story to the COP and trying to prove their point or find their solutions, but it's really when the dialogue starts, and when people are open to reconsider and learn from each other. So I think this is the key, and it's really inspiring to see so much activists, so many young representatives, representatives of women, representatives of vulnerable groups being part of the COP, and I'm really excited to see that these discussions, happening. So this is a good sign for the future.
I completely agree with what Helena just said, and all of these feelings they reminded me of this idea of FOMO. So I'm walking around here constantly with this kind of COP FOMO, that the fear of missing out, that I'm always just around the corner, there's something more interesting, more relevant happening. You're always looking for the most intriguing kind of discussions and panels, and honestly, it's full of it here. Yeah, it's been a blast. It's very overwhelming as well. So I think to be able to make sense of it, you have to quite get into the nitty-gritty of it, and I look forward to reflecting on it also quietly, without all the buzz around, and come to some more definitive insights myself. I think, that's
Yeah, I would definitely agree on that sense, that you would need a couple days to let everything sink in and come to a conclusion. But I would also feel it's really like a sort of emotional roller coaster as well, where the one moment is very hopeful when you're in the climate march and you see those people very committed to take action. But there are also tough moments when you see your own country or the European Union blocking progress on climate finance. Or loss and damage. And this way also, because we're also studying the international transparency system as an object of study, it becomes more, it's like it's coming alive in a way, in a sense. It's a very interesting way to engage with it, and also a strong motivator for me to when I'm back home again, dive into the literature, dive into the documents, to further do research on this. But I think this brings us to a conclusion of our Climate Talks Without Jargon. I'm not sure if we managed to keep all the jargon out. Probably
Did our best.
We did our best. Probably things, some words kind of popped up every now and then. But
Thank you very much, Max, for sharing this.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for all your insights. I think it has been a great discussion.
Maybe to the viewers, if there are any questions for clarification or interest in our work, please reach out.
Please reach out.
Yeah,
definitely.
Sure. All right.
Thank you very much.